Hi everyone. In this video, I'd like to talk about our basic defenses in terms of our bodies and our nervous system. So our biological defenses, our mammalian defenses. And this is number 3 in my little series about defenses, so that we can understand better how we do defend ourselves, so we can get to grips with what's going on for us a lot of the time. So this is going to be a basic view of our biological defenses, neurobiological defenses. But for a more in-depth view, you can go to my video, which is called Why Do I Feel So Unstable? So this is about our mammalian defenses and how, when we've come from a really dysfunctional, difficult background, how they become quite complex and not as simplified as they might be in someone who hasn't had that kind of upbringing. So let's have a look then at our biological defenses. So this involves the brain, the nervous system, the body, the emotions, and they all work together to protect us from threat. So threats of harm, threats of danger. So let's go and have a look at an article on my website. It's called Biological Defenses. Let's go and see. So firstly, we'll have a look at the amygdala. So the amygdala is the smoke alarm or the fire alarm of the brain. And this is, I think 2/3 of it, the cells in everyone, is devoted towards looking out for danger. But in people that have had particularly dysfunctional or traumatic backgrounds, it's quite swollen, they found on brain scans. So that's really interesting. So first of all, we look to the amygdala. The amygdala is the smoke alarm and emotional center of the brain. When threat is detected, the brain will respond by releasing neurochemicals, which will result in defensive action. The prefrontal cortex shuts down. This is the part which has regulatory abilities, cognitive and executive functioning, and analytical reasoning, which frees up the body to make the best response in the quickest and most effective way. So we can have a look at this diagram here, which shows us the amygdala, responsible for the response and memory of emotions, especially fear. So we see a threat, and this triggers then a series of reactions in the brain. So we could say the starting point is the amygdala in a way. Then we can go on to explain the brain. So there's a theory that's been around since the 60s called the Triune Brain, which means 3 in 1. Neuroscientist Paul D. MacLean formulated a model in the 1960s which was based on an evolutionary concept of the brain. The idea was that the part of the brain which appeared first is what we call the reptilian brain. Then around this grew the mammalian brain or limbic system. And then at a later date in mammals and humans, the neocortex developed. It has subsequently been found that the brain is not as simplified and compartmentalized as this in reality, but this theory does work in helping us to understand in general how the brain works together with the nervous system, especially in times of stress and in terms of defenses. So kind of in general, it's how it works. Obviously, everything is more complex than this is saying. So basically, the reptilian brain is typical instinctual behavior, aggression and dominance. The paleo-mammalian complex is about motivation and emotion, reproductive behavior and parental behavior. And then the neo-mammalian complex is about the ability for language, abstraction, planning and perception. And then in this article as well, I've added a video by SciShow, which is called No, You Don't Have a Reptilian Brain. And this explains how our understanding of brain function and how the different parts are linked has evolved since the triune theory was proposed. So it's more complex, more interlinked, quite interesting. So they talk about how octopi have complex ways of thinking, but they don't have a neocortex, for example. And a mouse has a little brain, but it can think or something. I can't really remember, to be honest, but quite interesting. So we have our amygdala, then we have our defense responses. So we're responding from our mammalian brain, that's where our amygdala lives, and then we have our reptilian brain, which has our instinctual responses to things. So then we need a trigger to activate the amygdala and then activate the response to it. So what's a trigger? A trigger is something that happens which invokes a defense response in us. The trigger will activate our brains and bodies to go into fight, flight, freeze, submit, or attach responses. The human body is self-protective and it automatically reacts to any cue indicating the possibility of danger. Triggers can be both universal, like snakes, spiders, rats, and cockroaches, and they can be personal, unique to our own experiences in our lives. For example, like the way someone who has been threatening to us in the past or presently smells or looks. So anyone that kind of looks familiar to that is immediately going to put us on guard. The brain is biased to respond to any danger signal it has known before, i.e. times of day, days of the week, gender and age, facial expressions, colours, smells or sounds, tone of voice or body language, touch, or our own emotions and body sensations. So there can be lots of things. Any of these will trigger a defense response, and our awareness of the reason why can be either subconscious or conscious. We may be aware of a strong response or of mild anxiety, and we may or may not know why it is there. Our body is telling us that we are in danger right now. So some triggers, then we are reacting to something which isn't a threat. So that's what that last sentence means, is that our body is telling us we're in danger right now. And this can happen when we've had a dysfunctional childhood. So someone who's been abusive, we see someone that looks like them, we respond with very strong fear sometimes, but we're actually not in danger in that moment. We think we're in danger. So that's how triggers work. Then we have the autonomic, so that means involuntary or unconscious nervous system. So now this is going to be triggered into reaction. So our autonomic nervous system is a part of our overall nervous system which controls the automatic functions of our bodies that we need for our survival. These are processes which we do not control consciously, and our brains manage them whether we are awake or sleeping. It regulates bodily functions such as the heart rate, digestion, respiratory rate, pupillary response, and urination. It is divided into the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system's primary process is to stimulate the body's fight or flight response. It is constantly active at a basic level to maintain homeostasis. So this is the maintaining of our internal physical and chemical conditions within our bodies to keep everything stable and working. The parasympathetic nervous system is responsible for stimulation of processes that occur when the body is at rest, such as salivation, urination, digestion, and others. This part is responsible for the defense responses of freeze and submit, which shut down the system. It also conserves energy and helps us to wind down after we've been in a stressful situation. It does this by triggering the responses needed to return to homeostasis, which is maintaining the stability of internal physical and chemical conditions within the body. So here we can see they have very different reactions. So when we are triggered, then our body goes into one or the other responses. So we can see here a diagram of the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous systems and the different things that happen to our body. So it can be interesting to know this. So it can be interesting to start to recognize our triggers and see what triggered response we go into, and then we can get familiar with what's happening in our bodies. So maybe then it won't feel quite so frightening. If we are in a stressful situation, the parasympathetic nervous system helps us to go into a state of being able to freeze, submit, and play dead. Submissive reactions include changes in body language and posture so that we appear appeasing and non-threatening. So maybe our shoulders will slump down, our heads will be down, we'll have a submissive appearance. So we're signaling that we're not a threat. The sympathetic nervous system directs blood and energy to the muscles, shuts down digestion, and frees up our energy to be able to fight or flee. So basically, the chain of events is that our amygdala is on the alert for danger, and when something happens that makes us feel fear, it triggers our nervous system and the mammalian and reptilian parts of our brain to go into a defense response of either fight, flight, freeze, submit, or attach. So I've added attach in there. I'll explain that a bit more at the end. Our logical brain goes offline so as not to slow down our defense responses, and we remain in this state until we sense that the danger has passed. So here's another diagram, which is the brain's response to stress. So here we have the amygdala, the brain's alarm center detects threats, starts the stress response. The hypothalamus is the brain's operation manager, and this releases stress hormones, prepares you for fight or flight, or freeze or submit. Then we have the hippocampus, the brain's biographer. This retrieves memories from the past and anticipates what will happen. Based on what's happened to us in the past, we're choosing a defense response which is appropriate. And then lastly, we have the prefrontal cortex. The brain's CEO analyzes information and designs a response and creates a plan to respond to stress. So as I've said earlier, the prefrontal cortex shuts down or goes offline, so to speak. That information is from Janina Fisher, PhD. She writes lots of books on trauma. She's written a really good book called The Fragmented Selves of Trauma Survivors, for example, where she goes into this theory in depth. So this source for this is Adobe, actually. I got it from Adobe. So I don't know what their source of information is. Looking at this, though, I would think that perhaps it depends on the severity of the trigger. For example, if your prefrontal cortex goes offline or not, or the information since then has been updated. So this is a new way of thinking about it. From my experience of working with people that have come from difficult backgrounds, they'll be triggered and then they'll have a triggered response come up. And then this is hard to shake. So it's a really strong response that comes on suddenly, intensely, and it can't be shaken off. And it can sometimes take hours or days to shake it off, no matter how your logical brain is talking to you. So really, you can be in your logical brain saying, don't worry, I'm being dramatic, or I don't need to worry anymore, or it was okay, or whatever the story is that we tell ourselves, but that mood state doesn't shift, that defense response doesn't shift. So it's complex, isn't it? In general, these are the things that I know to be true, but things are changing all the time, aren't they? So the brain's response to threat, the limbic system, or the mammalian emotional brain, perceives and reacts to threat, holds non-verbal emotional experiences and traumatic memory. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for solving problems, verbal communication and reasoning. It goes offline when under threat. Triggered feelings can become overwhelming. It becomes hard to think logically. The amygdala is in the limbic system and is the fire alarm of the brain, and in traumatized people it's swollen. And it is primed to respond to threat. It is also the emotional memory center. It responds to triggers in the environment. And the brain stem, or reptilian brain, controls our instinctive responses and bodily functions such as the heart rate and breathing, and it responds instinctively to signals of alarm from the amygdala. So then we can go into the concept of the window of tolerance. So when we are in optimal state, we are in our window of tolerance and we are functioning well, we are calm, we're thinking clearly, and we're able to problem solve. If there is a trigger in our environment, either internal or external, so something can be going on outside, or we can have a certain thought or a feeling or a memory or a flashback, something like that can happen, and then this can trigger a response as well. If there is a trigger in our environment, then we become triggered into a defense response. We then move out of our window of tolerance into either hyper-arousal if we go into fight or flight response, or hypo-arousal if we go into the freeze or submit response. So this is our sympathetic nervous systems and our parasympathetic nervous system. Our logical brain tends to go offline when we are triggered. The idea of the window of tolerance comes from Dr. Dan Siegel. And then there's a link to his website there if you want to go and have a look at him. And he's got quite a few YouTube videos as well where he talks about this idea of the window of tolerance, the triune brain, triggers, and all that kind of thing. So many people will find if they've come from a narcissistic family and they have narcissistic parents that their window of tolerance is quite narrow, and they'll often be triggered into fight, flight, freeze, or submit or attach. So it can be good to develop that self-awareness. The mammalian defenses, then, what are they? So we share a similar makeup to other mammals and many other kind of animals as well. In terms of the defenses we use, they can be categorized as fight, flight, freeze, submit, and attach. And the intensity of our responses will depend on the level of threat. So here I've listed each of those, and then the emotions, the body language, and the behavior that goes with each one. So we can get to know ourselves better this way and understand what's happening for us. So for fight, the emotions are anger, aggression, suspicion, rage, mistrust, indignation, being indifferent, haughty or hypervigilant. Body language is narrowed eyes, a still face, muscle tension in the shoulders, back and arms. Behaviors are sudden anger, a judgmental voice, violent dreams, suicidal, self-harming, impulsive, devaluing, and self-destructive. So in those symptoms are violent dreams, for example. So this is going to be things from our subconscious coming up to do with our triggers, as well as an immediate trigger if we saw a snake or something like that on the floor. Flight, the emotions are feeling trapped, distant, suspicious, unsafe, a sudden trapped feeling of needing to get out. Body language can be restless legs, fidgeting, sitting on the edge of a chair, looking away to doors and windows. So you're ready to run, basically. Behaviors, sitting close to doors and windows, eating disorders, addictions, being unable to commit, being ambivalent, keeping a distance from people, and running as well. Freeze, the emotions are fear, terror, being wary, and anxiety. Body language is frozen, breathing has stopped, the body is stiffed, the eyes are wide, and it can look fearful. Behaviors are OCD, so obsessive compulsive disorder, panic attacks, agoraphobia, general anxiety disorder, being phobic of being seen. Some people want to be seen as little as possible. Agitated, phobias, and scary dreams. Then we have the submit part of our defenses. The emotions that go with this are hopelessness, helplessness, self-loathing, feeling ashamed, feeling depressed, feeling worthless, and feeling despairing. Body language is shoulders rounded, an inability to make eye contact or sustain eye contact. Head is down, and the posture is appeasing and unthreatening. Behaviors are passive, good child, caretaker of others, going numb, a hopeless internal voice, and then being unable to say no. And the attach part of us then. So attach is our attachment cry. We cry when we're a baby. We cry for help. We shout for help. It's needing help from another person. It's wanting to attach to parental figures and other people. And this is more focused on actually what happens to that part of us when we've come from a dysfunctional background and those relationships with people close to us are really disrupted or really difficult, or we have abusive parents. So we're going to have emotions of grief, a fear of abandonment, a yearning for someone to come, or want to be rescued, feeling unlovable, feeling lonely, feeling sad, anxious, desperate, craving rescue and craving attention. There's separation anxiety, and there can be a neediness as well. Body language is body orientated towards possible source of help. There can be a shy look, a soft childlike expression, and we seek to be close to others as well. Behaviors can be sweet, charming, dependent, childlike, forgiving of attachment figures. So how do we stay attached to an abusive figure? We have to kind of have that abuse amnesia, don't we? So we forget what they're doing. We blame ourselves for things. We're very forgiving. We over-empathize with other people. We over-identify with other people's pain. We make excuses for people like, oh, well, they can't help it. They had a bad day. They had a bad childhood, etc., etc. So that's the brain and body. So the amygdala triggers the brain, the mammalian brain, the reptilian brain, which triggers our nervous system into reacting in either fight or flight or freeze or submit. And then we can see the behaviors that come out of that, which we are protecting ourselves with. So basically, that's our biological defenses and how they work. So obviously, it's more complex because lots of things are working together. Our brains, our bodies, and our emotions especially. And it's not as simple as this. It's more complicated. But it's basically that. So good for us to understand and good for us to know. And if you would like to see a more in-depth video about this, it's called Why Do I Feel So Unstable? And this is much more in-depth about the effects that having a dysfunctional family has on the defenses that we develop. So we're going to have lots of versions of fight, lots of versions of flight, lots of versions of freeze, submit and attach as well. We're going to have lots of submissive and freezing defensives because that's going to be our go-to response when we have a narcissistic parent, because we can't really fight and we can't really flee. So this is the third video in my defenses series. The next one's going to be how do we say no when we can't say no. So this is another thing that happens for people from narcissistic families, is they're so people pleasing and it can become ingrained in them that they just can't stand up for themselves. They can't say the things that they really want to say because something in our defenses, which freeze, comes in and we literally can't speak. So some people just might find they can't speak. Other people feel like a pressure in their chest or a tightness in their throat, or, there's lots of different ways it shows up for people. So it can be interesting to develop an awareness of that. So next video is how do we say no when we can't say no? And then the fifth video will be about the price we pay for having defenses. So the pluses and minuses of our defense system. The pluses are that we feel safe and it's been there for a long time and it has protected us because we're still alive, we're still here and we're still surviving. But there is also a price we pay for living in that system of defenses. And I'll explain that in video number 5. So I hope this was not too boring, actually. Maybe there was something in there that you didn't know already. Not super interesting, but I think important to know. And take care of yourselves wherever you are, and see you in the next one. Bye.